A Connecticut court has ordered far-right radio show host Alex Jones to pay almost $1 billion to the families of Sandy Hook Elementary School victims after proceedings found that Jones continuously spread lies that the deadliest school shooting in U.S. history had never actually happened.
In the years that followed the 2012 Sandy Hook shooting, the InfoWars host claimed the relatives of the 26 victims killed were part of a plot to take away people's guns, and that their grief was nothing more than an act. On Wednesday, the court sided with the victims who filed the defamation lawsuit against him. Now, Jones wasn't in court when the verdict was handed down, but he commented on his radio show, calling it hilarious and all made up. The victims are going to be laughing all the way to the bank, it seems, in this scenario. I saw a lot of really divided opinions on the internet. Some people thought that this was going to have a chilling effect. Other people obviously thought that this was some pretty justified comeuppance. Where do you land on this?
Yeah, I saw a lot of reaction from mostly people I would say are on the right, saying that this is a free speech issue, this is a problem. Look, if you think that defamation should exist at all as a category of speech that is not permissible, and I think many Republicans and conservatives do think defamation should exist as a category, then I don't see how you can be so upset about this. I mean, this wasn't like a clumsy error, like Jones just missed saying something once. He was very committed to saying things that were obviously false, that we all know that he knows to be false, for a long time in the most malicious and harassing way possible. The victims got, they got his audience, death threats, etc. Now, if you want to say that, look, you should be allowed to say things that are absolutely totally false and harmful and not suffer the consequence of being sued, okay, that could be the standard. I don't love the idea. I'm a free speech absolutist, and I'm not really convinced that defamation and libel are things we still need. But that's not the actual position I see, because and you mentioned this just before we started the segment, right? When people like Kyle Rittenhouse, the Covington Catholic boys, those were figures that conservative media wanted to see sue media outlets who'd gotten facts wrong about them. And I think in both those cases, media outlets had gotten facts wrong about them, and especially in the Covington case, absolutely deserved to get sued under the rules as they are. But that is also true for Alex Jones. Yeah, so, what we were talking about were this pair of tweets from Charlie Kirk, conservative commentator who back in 2019 tweeted, "Today, the Covington Catholic students filed a lawsuit seeking $250 million in damages against the Washington Post. Dozens more lawsuits expected as parents seek justice for their kids who have been slandered and defamed for the past month by the media. This time we fight back." Cut forward to this week with the Alex Jones holding, this isn't about calculating real damages from Alex Jones. This is about sending a message. If you upset the regime, they will destroy you completely, utterly, and forever. Now, I think what he's pointing to in part here is the huge volume of the judgment. And again, the judgment is related to not just the fact that, to your point, he very purposefully did this for a long period of time, kind of knowingly spreading falsehoods, but that he profited off of it. The whole point was that was a draw to his show. He was able to sell merchandise and all of his advertising revenue, and that the judgment was calculated to take into account how much he used the pain and suffering of these families for his personal benefit. Right. And it's not... And look, I take the point about the establishment of the regime, or whatever you want to call it, trying to silence people. We criticize that all the time. Major tech platforms are involved in this effort, colluding with the federal government to suppress conversations that I absolutely think you should be able to have about COVID, about other subjects. It happens manifestly. It is certainly true that the elites, the powers that be, want to chill speech, want to put more guardrails on speech. And we should oppose that. It's absolutely correct to oppose that. Is this an example of that? I think it's harder to say that the things Alex Jones said about whether a bunch of children had been killed in a mass shooting in Sandy Hook are you have to be really committed to this, to slot that into, like, you're just deciding that, well, Alex Jones is on my side because people I don't like also don't like him, so he's on my side, so then I have to defend his speech. And again, if you're just going to be consistent about it, if you're going to say no one should be able to be sued for saying things that are lies, okay, I think that might be fine, but that's clearly not what they're saying, because whenever it happens to, when it's happened to other sympathetic figures, part of the coalition, they've said, well, they should sue. And you can't find any different. Some will try to say, well, this is different because Jones was just saying, well, no, it clearly was libel.
Right. And he knew, I think part of the evidence that came out was, evidence that showed that he knew what he was doing is a real big part of this, that it was in fact malicious and not just a mistake. So it's interesting when you look at the Kyle Rittenhouse case. I do think that there was a lot of inaccurate, obviously it's not an opinion, there was a lot of inaccurate reporting about him. And I think it's interesting to think about how we would look at this case differently if the judgment weren't so high, if the conversation were about simply issuing a correction, writing articles that corrected the record, giving him an opportunity to write it up, at those kinds of things instead of the punitive monetary damages. And it makes me think about that famous McDonald's case from the 90s where a woman spilled hot coffee in her lap and got very extreme burns. And the public kind of turned against that case, in part because the judgment was so high. It was eventually brought down. But the initial judgment was calculated, I think, to be just one day of coffee sales at McDonald's in America. So it was supposed to suggest the proportionality here, that this is a huge corporation that is trying to basically make its coffee super hot to save pennies on a cup, pennies on the dollar. And as a consequence, this woman had burns that went down to her pelvic bone, an old woman who was not at all at fault here. But the fact that the judgment was so big was part of what caused the public to turn against her, because that part of the story, the fact that it was proportional, that she was getting very little in the grand scheme of what McDonald's could pay, was lost. And I wonder here if in some ways the fact that there's this $1 billion payout that's being demanded of him is affecting the discourse in a way that's taking the focus away from his accountability and putting it on the idea that he's a victim.
It's interesting you bring up the coffee case. So there's an anarchist law professor I'm a fan of, his name is John Hasness, who argues that, and he's libertarian, he's very against regulation and government laws, but he says that judge-made law, he's in favor of judge-made law of torts. So he cites that example of that case as a good example of an outcome, a legal decision that then changed policy that didn't involve legislatures coming together and arbitrarily deciding some number at which coffee is allowed to be hot and then deputizing some enforcement to some ridiculous agency that has no accountability. He argues that judge-made law is responsive to actual harm.
Yeah, so my libertarian Marxist law professor who taught us that case tends to agree. The problem is that so often, as in the coffee cases, the judgments are lowered because juries and judges can't be counted on to actually make corporations pay. And corporations are very, very good at avoiding judgment. Right here, Alex Jones has already filed for bankruptcy. You say you go bankrupt, your company can't be touched, and then you pop up somewhere later. So in theory, that's a good idea. And there's some legal mechanism you can use to apply liability standards that make it easier for people to get judgments. That's a whole other segment, though.
Yeah. But McDonald's lowered the temperature its coffee's at in a socially desirable way that now you don't nearly die when you spill it.
Yeah, baby steps. All right, we'll have more Rising for you right after this.